with these. All right. So June 2025, variant 24. By the way, now there's another variant. जो पहले नहीं होता था. From this year, we have variant 24 also. Um, with the help of a diagram, explain the impact of introducing an effective minimum price. Acha, so since we need a diagram, we're going to make a diagram. Make sure that your labels are always there. Labels का mark is always an important one. हमारा demand and supply. Because micro hai, to it's price and quantity. This is how the diagram is going to look like. Uh, Original supply, original demand. This could be your equilibrium price and quantity because they are mentioning it's an effective. So we must. Acha, I usually make the solid line like this. You can make a dotted line, but we must, in the diagram, you make sure that you mark uh, that it's P minimum. Either लगा हुआ है. It can be a dotted line also, no problem whatsoever. And I would always recommend that make sure that all your labels are there. Like for example, quantity demanded to have वो fall कर रही है. Um, right, something like this. नहीं बल्कि in fact arrow is not appropriate. And this is the quantity supplied, which is sort of increasing. And since quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied, we have an excess supply. So I think this would be your complete diagram. If I'm sure एक mark तो at least diagram का होगा for this particular question. Um, Diagram के अंदर make sure you do the surplus. It is saying explain the impact of introducing. So I guess in your writing, then I think you should definitely explain that P minimum above equilibrium, will create a surplus from Q1 to Q2, and even like a further explanation that price ऊपर जाएगी. So because the price is going up, quantity demanded will fall and quantity supplied will increase, therefore leading to a surplus. I think this would be your sort of like a complete explanation. फिर उसके बाद consider the effect on the consumer surplus for that product. Um, Consumer surplus for that product और ये analysis के अंदर है, usually knowledge and understanding definition should not be given, but since the term is mentioned, I think we should always, you never know, हो सकता है पहले consumer surplus की definition would be considered as part of knowledge and understanding. Um, in fact, even in my diagram, this is what I would actually do. मैं अपने डायग्राम के अंदर सेकंड पार्ट को भी कंसिडर करूंगा. And I will use this particular figure to do my explanation of what will happen to consumer surplus as a result of minimum price. So I would define consumer surplus, and consumer surplus की definition में all you have to say is that अपनी definitions please पक्की रखना. They're straightforward marks for definition. Don't try to complicate it in any particular way. जितना straightforward रख सकते हो रखो. Difference between the price consumer is willing to pay and the price they actually pay. I think this is a reasonable definition. It's not a good idea to go off it. अच्छा, उसके अलावा using the diagram, usually people make another diagram for it, लेकिन in my opinion ऊपर वाला diagram will suffice. basically you can give a reference like figure 1 shows something like uh, before P minimum, consumer surplus is area 1 plus 2 plus 3. And after P minimum, new consumer surplus is area 1. So something along this line. And yeah, something area show कर दिया consumer surplus, but what is really happening? I think we must mention also, वैसे थी I would have done this right at the beginning, consumer surplus explain करते के साथ ही that since price is rising, consumer surplus will fall. ये तो वैसे एरिया से भी पता लग जाता है, लेकिन I think it would be important for us to sort of like explain that. I have seen questions जिसके अंदर uh, even though second part के अंदर question के अंदर they haven't said, like for example in this particular question also, they're saying in the question that, you know, consider the effect on the consumer surplus for the product. They're not saying using a diagram show or something. The second part is not begging for a diagram, but I have seen questions in the past, and we have done those questions earlier, demand, supply, and elasticity के अंदर, that sometimes they even take this and they would like to see a diagram for it. Especially अगर पहले part में जो diagram है that can show that relevant bit of it. तो जो हमने ये किया है, आई थिंक इसके अंदर तुम्हें पहले पार्ट के भी मार्क्स मिल जाएंगे, जिसमें डायग्राम मिनिमम के मार्क्स मिल जाएंगे, और कंज्यूमर सरप्लस की भी अगर क्वेश्चन के अंदर रिक्वायरमेंट हो तो आपको वो भी मिल जाएगी. In fact, let me see now, एक second. I have a marking scheme right over here. So,
Do it
yeah,
on the same diagram.
show it on the same, doesn't matter, as long as it's not complicating stuff. Examiner are told कि आपने किस तरीके से marks को देखना है, what are the important bits, and even if it's a single diagram, you can definitely show. Unless it becomes way too complicated, so फिर it's a better idea that you can do a separate diagram. So, एक second, let me just go over the marking scheme. For an accurately drawn demand and supply diagram, I think what this just simply means कि आपने, just done this with proper labels and all. So I think 1 mark is for that. Showing the minimum price above equilibrium and the resulting increase and fall in demand. तो I think वो हमने arrows के through and Q1, Q2 के through वो कर लिया है. Third mark for knowledge and understanding they're giving is for explanation that how this will lead to a surplus. I think ये तो, in my opinion, this could have gone as an analysis. Um, although analysis में जा सकता था, but I guess not. But नीचे जो an explanation of what is meant by consumer surplus, I would have actually done this. ये मेरा thought process होता कि explanation of surplus would have been नीचे, because impact of, बल्कि ठीक है, चलेगा, मसला नहीं है. आई थिंक मेरी नजर में तो दिस इज वेयर एक मार्क मिलना चाहिए था सिर्फ मिनिमम के साथ एंड ऑल ऑफ दिस. दिस इज जस्ट रिडिकुलस दैट दे आर गिविंग यू मार्क फॉर अ सिंपल डिमांड सप्लाई डायग्राम. ये नहीं होना चाहिए था. कंज्यूमर सरप्लस की डेफिनेशन ऊपर होनी चाहिए थी, बट खैर कोई बात नहीं. Analysis, use of a diagram to clearly show a fall in consumer surplus. How would they do that? How can you use a diagram to show a fall in the consumer surplus? I think explanation, I guess the maximum you can do is this. Uh, कि किस तरीके से area 1, 2, 3 के बाद. Otherwise, there is no possibility of showing. Explanation will build this information in. I don't think graph में there is any other possibility of we talking about it. ठीक है. So, based on the question, I think we have sort of answered. Consider the effect on the consumer surplus of that product. Consumer surplus is falling. All right. फिर अब जब इवैल्यूएशन की बात आएगी तो इवैल्यूएशन के अंदर ऑब्वियसली जहां डिमांड सप्लाई डायग्राम आता है there are two things that you can always talk about, whether it is about taxation, subsidy, minimum, maximum, buffer stock, all of it. Okay? एक तो number one discussion in analysis we can always place in is one is about for evaluation कि minimum price अगर लगाया है तो how high have you placed uh, the minimum, right? So, for example, just to show if this is our demand and supply and this is where we are placing the minimum, so it is not very high above the original. Do you notice? It's not that very high above. So, what we see is that yes, the consumer surplus has fallen, but not by so much. But if the size of the minimum price was on a lot more above the equilibrium, then it would have had made a much more substantial impact. So in our evaluation, the first thing that you can definitely talk about is um, the size of, not the size, that's a strange thing to say, um, sort of like how high above the equilibrium price is the minimum imposed, you know? So the higher it is, the more effect it's going to have on the consumer surplus. It's going to reduce the consumer surplus. Vague हो जाता अगर if I had said कि that's how big effect it would have. तो जितना हाई ऊपर लगाएंगे उतना ज्यादा बड़ा फॉल आएगा. जितना थोड़ा सा ऊपर लगाएंगे उतना कम इम्पैक्ट आएगा. That's one discussion that could have been made. And the second one is obviously price elasticity of demand. Supply is irrelevant. So again, I would have gone through the whole headache of agar elastic hai, you know, and if you are imposing compared to this, agar inelastic hota, तो then कितना बड़ा consumer surplus पे impact आता. So what we know is कि inelastic के अंदर has greater fall in consumer surplus, greater fall in consumer surplus compared to if PET is elastic, right? So something along this line, I think there would have been good enough of an explanation. I think PED जो है will always work and even the size of it. So इस तरीके से कुछ ये discussion होना चाहिए था. यही चीज हम taxation के अंदर भी by the way लिखते हैं that this is how it would have had an impact. ठीक हो गया. Uh, other than this, आई थिंक 8 मार्कर के अंदर तो सिर्फ यही कोई रिसेंट के अंदर क्वेश्चन है और मिनिमम मैक्सिमम. यूजुअली मिनिमम एंड मैक्सिमम के जो क्वेश्चंस आते हैं दोज आर मोर ऑन द 12 मार्क side. So, for example, if you take a look at this question, ये बहुत repetitive sort of like a question है. June 24, in fact, I did check one of these. Kids don't do so well in these questions for some reason. Like if you go over this question, this is from our variant 2024 के अंदर. Assess whether fixing a minimum price is likely to be the best policy to reduce the consumption of demerit goods. ठीक हो गया. इसका part A, let me just see what part A is, this particular question का. Yeah, part A was about you had to explain the difference between merit and demerit. Uh, Basic definition with example, simple 3 marks. We've done this question before. And how subsidy is likely to have an increase in consumption. Subsidy से supply curve shifts to the right, prices fall down, people buy more of it. But obviously 8 mark में भी आपको counter करना होता है, तो maybe subsidies might not make that impact because of information failure or maybe the elasticity or something. But the second question, the second part of this is assess whether fixing a minimum price is likely to be the best policy to reduce the consumption of the demerit good. Now, for a question like this, the first thing you need to know is कि भाई इसका answer structure क्या होना चाहिए. Once you know what the answer structure is, I think the things should start falling into places right after that. ठीक है जी. We know कि हमें कोई marks नहीं मिलते हैं for definitions, right? क्योंकि इसका part A has nothing to do with minimum prices, but डीमेरिट की डेफिनेशन ऊपर हो चुकी है तो फिर तो बिल्कुल भी लिखने की जरूरत नहीं है. राइट, बट इफ यू फील कि मेरे स्टार्टिंग पॉइंट के लिए अच्छा है तो यू माइट वांट टू डिफाइन आइदर ऑफ द टू डेफिनेशंस, बट यूजुअली देयर इज नो मार्क फॉर इट. एटलीस्ट हमने ये नोटिस किया है कि हमारे वेरिएंट के अंदर तो दे डोंट, for some reason they don't place any marks for explanation of the term. It's directly the application that they are looking into. हमें पता है स्ट्रक्चर क्या है. सबसे पहले आपने एक्सप्लेन करना है कि मिनिमम प्राइसेस किस तरीके से कंजम्पशन को रिड्यूस करती हैं. Would you be graded for making a diagram? Because I can assure you 95% of the kids are going to make the diagrams for it. ठीक है. Even if you make the diagram, basically that diagram is going to end up supporting your answer. So if you feel that you can do a better job by making the diagram, and then explaining, अब demerit है, if you want to factor in the information कि, demerit goods are usually inelastic in nature, and you want to factor that information in and then make it accordingly, it's up to you. It's perfectly fine. Um, Even if you just, don't factor that in और आप अपना perfectly place करते हो minimum को above equilibrium and you do the whole labels as we've seen in another question जो 2025 में आया था, uh, and you show that how it is able to reduce, so I think you've done the part जो question की requirement है. But again, once you start explaining the diagram, then I'm like, okay, G, how's the breakdown? It's a 12 marker question, so 8 marker for knowledge, understanding, and analysis, and 4 marks for evaluation. If you do this diagram and you explain me that P minimum above equilibrium की वजह से the prices will rise, and as a result quantity demanded is going to fall, like for example from Q0 to Q1. अगर आप diagram नहीं भी बनाते हैं and you say कि prices would rise and the consumption will fall, that's good enough. If you do the definitions and if you do the diagram and you explain using the diagram, I think I will give you somewhere near level 1 2 marks. ठीक है. फिर उसके बाद you must, in order to go to level 2, you must talk about the problems of the minimum. और प्रॉब्लम्स भी कोई आई डोंट वांट लाइक सम generic problems. What I want is that how P minimum will not reduce consumption. That is what we want to know. ठीक है. तो इसके अंदर you can talk about obviously demerit goods जो होते हैं उसका PED जो होता है वो less than 1 होता है, which means it is inelastic, which means that the percentage change or percentage rise in the price will be lesser, sorry, no, will be greater, but the percentage fall in quantity demanded will be lesser. So hence it will be not so effective. Okay. Other than that, you can also talk about कि आपने price बढ़ाई and you were hoping कि consumption गिर जाएगी. But we know in reality there is also a possibility. I think you should always talk about at least two problems को जरूर discuss किया करो. फॉर आर्ग्यूमेंट के लिए विच आई जस्ट डन ऊपर वाली साइड, सॉरी, इससे ऊपर जो फॉर आर्ग्यूमेंट है उसके अंदर आई डोंट सी देयर इज मच दैट वी कैन एक्चुअली राइट, सो डायग्राम कैन एक्चुअली हेल्प यू विद द सपोर्ट. Another problem we can write about is obviously the black market. मिनिमम के अंदर भी ब्लैक मार्केट्स कैन अराइज. ब्लैक मार्केट्स को हम इनफॉर्मल मार्केट्स की भी बात कर सकते हैं. इनफॉर्मल मार्केट्स कि किस तरीके से पी मिनिमम लगाया अबव इक्विलिब्रियम, इट इज इलीगल टू सेल बिलो दैट, but producers, क्योंकि they have produced a surplus of this good, they might want to sell this product in the market at lower prices and just try and get rid of it. That whole explanation is absolutely fine. Then even information failure always works जब merit और demerit की बात होती है. That even if you place an a P minimum, you will have the information failure that people don't recognize the true cost of these goods and they will continue to consume it. So that still applies. Um, if you do all of this, I think maximum you can get is level 2, 5 marks. You can't go to level 3. In order to go to level 3 for this question, because it talks about policy best, okay? अच्छा, अगर ये क्वेश्चन होता कि if minimum price is an effective policy to reduce the consumption, तो फिर in that case they would probably might have asked for a diagram also. तो फिर you would have done the diagram, this explanation, this जितनी ज्यादा तुम problems और explanation देते effectiveness के ऊपर, तुमको उतने ticks मिलते. So the number of ticks in your paper represents the number of marks. Now just imagine if this question was not to do with the best policy, but is the effective, it's an effective policy. So that means कि you don't have to write an alternative policy. ठीक हो गया. अब अगर alternative policy नहीं लिखनी, as we've discussed this before also, तो फिर a diagram is required. एक टिक में डायग्राम का लगाता, ठीक है. फिर एक टिक में इसका लगाता दैट अबव इक्विलिब्रियम, और एक टिक में लगाता कि यस लेस देन. तो 3 मार्क्स में इधर दे देता, लेवल 2 3 मार्क्स. ठीक है, बिकॉज दिस अलाउज यू टू कनेक्ट टू द क्वेश्चन, सो देयरफॉर आई वुड हैव गिवन अ मार्क फॉर दैट. फिर उसके बाद प्रॉब्लम्स के अंदर पीईडी का डिस्कशन एंड हाउ इट विल रिड्यूस. ठीक है, सो आई एम गिविंग समवेयर अराउंड लाइक 4 मार्क फॉर इट. फिर ब्लैक मार्केट का आप एक्सप्लेनेशन करते हैं हाउ क्वांटिटी वुड हैव रिड्यूस्ड, आई वुड हैव गिवन अ मार्क फॉर दैट. तो अभी अगर आप नोटिस करो तो आई ओनली हैव 5 टिक्स. तो मैं लेवल 2 5 मार्क्स आपको दे रहा हूं अभी तक. इफेक्टिव का क्वेश्चन होता, इंफॉर्मेशन फेलियर का भी लिखा होता, तो आई वुड हैव गिवन यू 6 मार्क्स. डू यू अंडरस्टैंड? क्योंकि ये क्वेश्चन इज टू डू विद इज इट द बेस्ट पॉलिसी, तो नाउ लेवल 3 पे जाने के लिए इन माई हेड आई एम थिंकिंग, अच्छा इस बच्चे को लेवल 3 पे जाने के लिए ही मस्ट टॉक अबाउट एन ऑल्टरनेटिव पॉलिसी. कि सिगरेट कंजम्पशन और रिडक्शन के लिए व्हाट कुड बी एन ऑल्टरनेटिव पॉलिसी, बिकॉज बेस्ट के मार्क्स आपको अदरवाइज मिल नहीं सकते। तो एन एक्सप्लेनेशन ऑफ दैट, यूजली मेरिट डीमेरिट के केस में क्योंकि इंफॉर्मेशन फेलियर है, तो ऑल्टरनेटिव पॉलिसी के अंदर आई वुड हैव ऑलवेज रिकमेंडेड कि आप इंफॉर्मेशन फेलियर को खत्म करने की कोई बात करें, समथिंग लाइक education about harmful effects, right? Harmful effects of demerit. तो डीमेरिट में अगर आप कैसे कर सकते हो, एडवर्टाइजमेंट कैंपेन्स के थ्रू कर सकते हो। प्लीज अपनी एक्सप्लेनेशन के अंदर जो है वेगनेस नहीं छोड़ो, मैक्सिमम एक्सप्लेन करो। एडवर्टाइजमेंट, बिकॉज रिमेंबर तुम्हारा ए जो है वो केस स्टडी एंड माइक्रो के ए और बी के अंदर तुम्हारा ए सील हो जाता है, राइट? उसके बाद जो मैक्रो का क्वेश्चन होता है उसमें तो एक वो जो आखिरी के 2-4 मार्क रह जाते हैं, you basically get that. So even if you spend a lot of time in your case study and your micro के दोनों essays के अंदर, and you've done a reasonable job, chances are that you've already crossed uh, the 18 mark का threshold in a way. ठीक है, so if you've done that, if you crossed like 18-19 marks, तो last macro के question के अंदर you just need to get another 5, 6, 7 marks out of 20. तो I think वो तुम्हारे 8 marker के अंदर you do a reasonable get about like 4 marks आप उधर उठा लेते हो, and final उसमें भी. So make sure that your question number 2 or your question number 3 when you're attempting micro का, try to get the maximum marks possible over there by maximum information. So advertisement campaigns could be one of those that can get you the marks. ठीक है, I always recommend कि जरूर इसकी alternative को भी explain किया करो। अच्छा, by the way, I've forgotten, when you're going to do this, again, the question का reference से जरूर connect किया करो. The question was saying कि is it the best policy to reduce the consumption? So you have to talk about how education about the harmful effects of the demerit goods through advertisement campaign will reduce the demand for the good and therefore reduce the consumption. So इसको जरूर close किया करो. It is important and mandatory for you to close that information. फिर for more marks, obviously you can talk about indirect taxes. ठीक है, इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेस को आप जरूर लिखें कि किस तरीके से इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेस बढ़ाने से कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन बढ़ेगी, जिसकी वजह से सप्लाई गिरेगी, जिसकी वजह से प्राइस बढ़ेगी, एंड therefore quantity demanded will fall. I'll give you another tick for this. I personally feel that you should always talk about the counter. एक छोटा सा मार्क डाल दो, बस एक छोटी सी एक्सप्लेनेशन डाल दो कि हाउ एडवर्टिजमेंट्स कैन फेल, मीनिंग दैट मे बी लाइक लैक ऑफ फंड्स, जिसकी वजह से यू कांट रीच इन मैक्सिमम मार्केट्स, और poorly designed, or even it depends on consumer response, something like that. और इसके अंदर इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेस के अंदर तो हमेशा पीडी इन इलास्टिक का पॉइंट always works, right? So that sort of like covers, this is like good 18 mark, 8 marks complete तुमको full मिलेंगे इसके अंदर, because there are enough ticks and there is nothing which can be taken away. So अब जहां तक बात होती है evaluation की, question is, let's go back to the question so that we know exactly what we're answering. Assess whether fixing a minimum price is likely to be the best policy to reduce the consumption of demerit goods. Now, for my evaluation, since I've explained how this policy is going to work and what are the problems in this policy and all of that, my evaluation needs to consider minimum prices, what I've written upper, but I can't repeat the question. It needs to be something fresh but connected to the points above. And because question was about is it the best policy, I have to talk about an alternative. And then I have to make a comparison of one policy against the other. So therefore, this is a better policy than that needs to be your evaluation discussion. For example, I would say the success of minimum price depends on how high the minimum price is imposed and how well the government is supervising. Do you see that? I haven't spoken about this in my problems, the points that I've just talked about. I've talked about inelastic nature. Independently, I have talked about it. But now I'm talking about how high it is imposed or how well the government supervise this policy. The better the supervision, the more effective the policy will be in reducing the consumption. ठीक हो गया? On the other hand, alternative policy की मैं बात करूंगा. It also depends on since the demand for demerit goods are inelastic, so it depends on how high the indirect taxes are placed. So we could see that how big of an impact it has created in the reduction of the demerit goods. Now, although I know that a lot of kids, what they're going to say something would be कि मिनिमम प्राइसेस से बेहतर है इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेस बिकॉज मिनिमम प्राइस लगाने की वजह से इकोनॉमी के अंदर सरप्लस क्रिएट हो जाता है while if you had imposed a tax we still would have had an equilibrium. तो ये जो सरप्लस प्रोडक्शन हो गई है ये प्रॉब्लम नहीं एग्जिस्ट करता therefore what it shows is that minimum price लगाने की वजह से there is another problem which is being created, which is resource misallocation, which is happening, जो कि indirect taxes में नहीं हो रहा. And both would have created the same effect on the reduction. लेकिन क्या हुआ कि इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेस के अंदर एक लेस प्रॉब्लम है एंड गवर्नमेंट वुड हैव गॉटन एन एक्स्ट्रा अमाउंट ऑफ revenue which the government would have used to advertise about the harmful effects. लेकिन यहाँ तो प्योरली रिसोर्स मिसएलोकेशन हो रही है एंड उसकी वजह से इनफॉर्मल का भी प्रॉब्लम आ जाता है मोर बर्डन. Now this is me going off the whole idea कि which one is the better policy, but it sort of makes sense कि which one is the best policy to reduce consumption. तो दोनों reduce कर रही हैं लेकिन एक में ज्यादा added value है तो maybe examiner might feel कि you know what there is an added value that the student has done so maybe we can give a level 2 3 mark at least because the kid has while keeping in mind that both policies have been discussed and then went a step forward and have made a discussion that this one is better than that one. So compare किया ना two policies को तो वो I think would have been relevant. Let me see if that's what they've done in the marking scheme. Um, for the evaluation wala point. Let me see. Requires an assessment of at least one another policy to be compared against the minimum price policy, which leads to a justified conclusion as to whether the minimum pricing is the best policy to reduce or not. So it's a must thing. इवैल्यूएशन में एग्जामिनर के लिए जीरो देना इज द easiest thing. And I've mentioned that if you've seen the other lectures and all, I've mentioned this over and over again कि एग्जामिनर के लिए इवैल्यूएशन के मार्क्स देना इतना आसान है और स्टूडेंट के लिए इवैल्यूएशन के मार्क्स गेन करना उतना ही मुश्किल है बिकॉज इवैल्यूएशन की रिक्वायरमेंट्स इतनी ज्यादा होती है कि यू मस्ट टॉक अबाउट one policy which is minimum and do a comparison with the alternative policy, and that policy comparison must make sure that you have concluded that therefore this policy is better than that one. Okay, most of the time what kids do is, and I've seen this very often, this is the worst way you can do your answer. And you'll be surprised kitne percentage of kids actually end up doing that. They read the question that assess whether fixing a minimum price is likely to be the best policy to reduce. Kids start off by saying minimum price is not the best policy. The better policy is indirect taxes, knowledge and understanding, उसके अलावा you can have like subsidizing alternative, उसके अलावा और क्या पॉलिसीज हो सकती हैं ऑल्टरनेटिव के अंदर? एजुकेशन हो गया, इंफॉर्मेशन फेलियर को खत्म करना हो गया, ऑल्टरनेटिव को प्रमोट करना और इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेस. आई थिंक दीज आर गुड इनफ. दे राइट ऑल ऑफ दिस. There is a problem with all of this. If you end up writing all of this, the problem is you're really not answering the question. I don't think मैं तुमको level 1 2 marks से ज्यादा दे सकता हूँ, even though तुमने बहुत अच्छा, तुमने सारी अदर पॉलिसीज को एक्सप्लेन कर दिया. आई डोंट थिंक आई कैन गिव यू मोर देन level 1. मोस्ट level 2 3 marks. इससे ऊपर मैं नहीं दे सकता क्योंकि एवेल्युएशन तो जीरो हो गया बिकॉज मिनिमम का डिस्कशन ही नहीं है. मिनिमम को डिस्कस कर लिया और ऑल्टरनेटिव नहीं लिखा तो level 2 मिल सकता है फॉर एंड अगेंस्ट आर्ग्यूमेंट का, लेकिन level 3 नहीं मिल सकता और इवैल्यूएशन में जीरो मिलेगा बिकॉज ऑल्टरनेटिव डिस्कशन नहीं है. सो दिस इज व्हाट वी आर लुकिंग एट इट इन अ वेरी ऑब्जेक्टिव वे कि डज द किड क्वालिफाई. एंड अगेन जब आप, वन ऑफ द मिस्टेक्स ऑल्सो व्हाट किड्स डू इज बहुत अच्छा ऊपर का आंसर लिखा और फिर in their evaluation they end up repeating what they've written upper. You're not getting a mark. It's an ऊपर का extension होना चाहिए. Like we discussed in our essay, the extension could have been in terms of how well the markets are supervised, how much of an indirect tax was imposed, how high the minimum prices were imposed, elasticity. Hmm. क्योंकि देखो, इन इलास्टिक के अंदर भी 0.1 भी इन इलास्टिक है और 0.8 भी इन इलास्टिक है, लेकिन दोनों का इम्पैक्ट ऑन द रिडक्शन विल बी डिफरेंट. ओके, so that is also one of the things that we want to be a little on the mindful side.
You have to
Okay.
choose one, or can you say both?
Choose one in the sense, what do you mean?
Which is the best policy?
You have to choose one. Best के अंदर please choose one. Um, because that's what they're asking you. Which one is likely to be the best policy? अब जो भी तुम डिस्कशन कर रहे हो उसके अंदर आई थिंक वन का केस शुड बी स्ट्रोंगर देन द अदर वन. Try not to keep a vague one. But the main question is minimum price is likely to the best or not. I think usually majority time the question's answer is that it is not the best because alternative policies हैं market के अंदर which may in obviously a lot of circumstances. इसके अंदर तो I think undoubtedly minimum prices से बेहतर policies are available. तो इसकी वजह से I think even like a discussion of a short run versus a long run could have been an effective one for you. आप वो भी डिस्कस कर सकते हो. लाइक फॉर एग्जांपल एजुकेशन और ये जो है वो लॉन्ग रन के अंदर इम्पैक्ट लेकर आती, शॉर्ट रन के अंदर नहीं. लेकिन लॉन्ग रन में आपको सारे सुपरविजन कॉस्ट और ब्लैक मार्केट्स और ये सारी फिक्र करने की जरूरत नहीं थी. एंड so they would have been much more effective overall. तो
What about the economy?
what about the economy?
Which type of economy it is?
Meaning in terms of command and all?
Like if there's inflation or
Uh, whether there is inflation or not, maybe I don't think उसका कोई effect तो नहीं आता ना on the policy. Um,
if the
minimum.
GDP and the government's control all that.
Okay, so one of the things you want to do is you want to avoid micro के question में macro के discussions. Inflation and GDP, these are all on the macro side. Try to keep it on the micro element of the demerit goods and specifically things relating to demerit. जब आप बात करते हैं कि overall economy ठीक नहीं चल रही है and inflation is there, तो वो तो हर गुड को इफेक्ट कर रही है, तो उसका डीमेरिट के साथ लिंक क्या है? So whatever you're writing needs to make sure that it has an discussion is about how the policy is having an effect on the consumption of the demerit specifically. Can't be too general. कि, you say कि inflation होने की वजह से जो है, it might not make much of a difference. One of the things that I can think of is, like, for example, if there is rapid inflation in the economy and you're placing a minimum price, ठीक है? So one of the failure of the government is their inability to raise the minimum prices with the inflation. So that is something, but again, it's a very long shot. Please simplify it, keep it to the context, keep it to the textbook. Don't go too far off in your explanation. Try to just keep it to the micro side as much as you can. In fact, I say the same thing with macro ke questions that try not to bring in too much micro concepts in it. Sometimes elasticities can fit in, but there are rare instances where elasticities can fit in. Um,
You assume it's the same country or economy.
yeah, yeah, please. Yeah, don't talk in terms of different countries. Apply it to your country, apply it to your basic uh, context only. All right. So, इसी कॉन्टेक्स्ट में रहते हुए um, 2023 के अंदर there are a lot of questions on minimum and maximum. Let me upload a file. 2023 के अंदर मिनिमम मैक्सिमम पे काफी क्वेश्चन है। एक मैं मैक्सिमम के ऊपर एक एक क्विक ओवरव्यू कर लेता हूँ। um, about one of the questions, जून 23 के अंदर एक क्वेश्चन आया है। Let me just upload that paper. बस ये वाला क्वेश्चन, इट्स अ गुड आइडिया टू डू दिस वन, क्योंकि हमने एक क्वेश्चन अभी अटेम्प्ट किया है जिसके अंदर हमने डीमेरिट की बात की है, ठीक है? Sometimes it's quite possible that they may give you a question um, जिसके अंदर वो स्पेसिफिकली कोई गुड मेंशन कर देते हैं। तो इफ दे डू दैट, तो आई थिंक इट्स ऑलवेज अ वाइजर आइडिया कि आप उसी गुड के टर्म्स के अंदर ही बात करें। फॉर एग्जांपल जून 23 22 क्वेश्चन के अंदर या लेट्स टेक अ लुक एट these questions. I think it's quite possible कि मैंने इसका 8 मार्कर तो कराया ही होगा। The eighth marker for this one is about consumer and producer surplus and how a rise in the price due to higher cost of production will always. I think we have done this question. Now, let's take a look at this question right here. This question is about um, a government wishes to keep the price of essential food, such as rice and all, affordable, right? or to help the low income people. So पूरा context दिया हुआ है इन्होंने. So we want to stay within the context, not go too out of it. And at the same time, they're saying कि assess whether the policy of fixing the maximum price for essential food is likely to be more effective than a policy of making transfer payments. तो इस क्वेश्चन के अंदर तो इन्होंने आपको दो पॉलिसीज की बात कर ली है कि this one or that one will be more effective, right? So for a question like this, how do we start? Again, there's no point in at least हमारे variant के अंदर तो there is no reason to do the explanation. Please don't spend too much time in doing that explanation and all. Directly jump into the question, which is about the government की ये policy, how effective will it be? You directly need to go into the advantages and disadvantages of minimum price for an essential good. Maximum price जब आप लगाते हैं तो I think definition के through already you sort of make an explanation. But again, similar to the question that we did अभी 24 वाला, diagram is not asked for, but if you can use the diagram and you feel that the diagram can actually support you in your explanation that how P maximum is imposed below equilibrium, and as a result, quantity supply do falls, but quantity demand increases, so the affordability sort of increases. That whole explanation that how affordability can increase by lowering the prices um, may encourage people to consume more. So, it's a reasonably good policy. People's living standards and all will improve. And, just sort of like an explanation, use a diagram and do that explanation. I think you're going to get up to level 2, 3 marks maximum if you've used the diagram and explained it कि किस तरह से price fall से affordability बढ़ेगी and question links to the affordability ka context, and how it will help the low income households. Your explanation should include that. But then obviously we have to do the counter argument that how maximum prices will fail in doing this. So naturally, when we're talking about this, your explanation ke andar chances are that you will end up explaining that how बिलो द प्राइस की वजह से क्वांटिटी डिमांड जो है वो तो बढ़ जाएगी बट क्वांटिटी सप्लाइड विल फॉल एंड एज अ रिजल्ट देयर विल बी शॉर्टेज. Some people will benefit while many will not be able to buy that product. That's your counter argument, by the way. And I personally like the whole black market concept that if not properly supervised, black market can arise and people are willing to pay a much higher price for this good. And so, consumers' affordability is not really going to increase as a result of this. Um, you know, um, और क्या चीजें हो सकती हैं? So you need to know कि maximum prices और क्या failures होते हैं maximum price के. When you impose a maximum price, it is universal to everyone in the economy that nobody can buy rice above this price, right? तो इसके अंदर जब हम बात करते हैं तो we talk about the idea of how it does create equity sort of a situation. It's not that the rich can outbid the poor, you know. So that sort of an equity comes in. I think that could be one of the advantages that we can talk about in terms of affordability and all. Um, so I think that is one of the things that we can talk about. So counter हो गया इसके अंदर कि low income के लिए black market and then the whole problem can arise and maybe their affordability may not rise. If you do this, maximum how it will work in the context of low income and affordability rising, uska for and against argument, I will give you level 2, 5 marks. Remember how the markings is 8. Level 1 gives you 1 to 2 marks. Level 2 gives you 3 to 5 marks, and level 3 gives you 6 to 8 marks. तो minimum के अंदर, if you do both sides of the argument nicely with the graphs and maximum points, I'll give you maximum ticks. 5 ticks हो गए, even 6, 7 ticks भी हो गए. I will constrain myself to 5 ticks because ट्रांसफर पेमेंट्स जब तक एक्सप्लेन नहीं करोगे लेवल 3 पे नहीं जा सकते हो. लेवल 3 पे जाने के लिए यू मस्ट टॉक अबाउट ट्रांसफर पेमेंट्स की एटलीस्ट 4 आर्ग्यूमेंट. अगर तुमने मिनिमम का 4 आर्ग्यूमेंट किया, ट्रांसफर का 4 आर्ग्यूमेंट किया, लेवल 2 पे कैप. ओके. लेवल 3 पे जाने के लिए दोनों के एडवांटेजेस और एटलीस्ट एक का डिसएडवांटेज मस्ट बी टॉक्ड अबाउट. लेकिन फुल मार्क के लिए यू हैव टू डू transfer payments का advantage disadvantage while keeping in the context of low income households and their affordability, and maximum का for and against argument while keeping in mind of the low income. ठीक है, that's how the structure will work. That's how I will grade a question like that. ट्रांसफर पेमेंट्स के अंदर ऑब्वियसली हमें पता है ट्रांसफर पेमेंट्स इज बेसिकली फ्री मनी गिवन टू द कंज्यूमर्स. ट्रांसफर पेमेंट्स के अंदर इट्स ऑलवेज अ वाइज आइडिया टू डू, क्योंकि यहाँ पे ट्रांसफर पेमेंट्स अफोर्डेबिलिटी की बात हो रही है फॉर अ लो इनकम. तो फूड की बात हुई हुई है, तो मेरी नजर में तो दोस्त फूड वाउचर्स विच द गवर्नमेंट, यूएस वगैरह के अंदर आप इसको फूड स्टैम्प्स कहते हैं, जो लो इनकम वालों को मिलते हैं. This is given directly to people who have low incomes and they can directly go and they can buy the stuff. It is much more targeted. जैसे ऊपर minimum के अंदर क्या हो रहा था, now this is my evaluation वाला point, but just to bring a clarity, मैक्सिमम जब आप लगाते हो तो उसमें अमीर गरीब का फर्क नहीं क्रिएट किया जा रहा, और ब्लैक मार्केट का स्ट्रेस है. फूड वाउचर्स के अंदर अमीर को तो वो वैसे ही नहीं जा रहा, ये डायरेक्टली गरीब को टारगेट है, सो इट्स अ मच मोर टारगेटेड, राइट. सो दैट वुड बी वन ऑफ माय एडवांटेज कि दिस इज मच मोर ऑन द टारगेट साइड. टारगेटेड पॉलिसी है, तो ये अच्छी पॉलिसी है इन दैट सेंस. इसके अंदर अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट बेनिफिट्स इज आल्सो वन ऑफ दोज. अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट बेनिफिट्स, क्योंकि अगेन ये भी गरीब को ज्यादा अफेक्ट करता है, इन द सेंस कि अगर आप अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट बेनिफिट्स दे रहे हैं तो एक बंदा जिसकी नौकरी चली गई तो उसकी अफोर्डेबिलिटी का इशू आ गया. यू सी हाउ यू नीड टू मेक द कनेक्शन ओवर एंड ओवर अगेन. तो अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट बेनिफिट की देने की वजह से आप उस बंदे की अफोर्डेबिलिटी को टारगेट कर सकते हैं और आप उसको बेसिक फूड के लिए पैसे दे सकते हैं. ऑब्वियसली बंदा बेसिक फूड स्टफ एंड ये ही कंज्यूम करेगा. हाउएवर, अगेन लाइक आई सेड, यू मस्ट डू काउंटर. इसमें तो करना जरूरी है काउंटर, बिकॉज इट्स अ 12 मार्कर और दोनों पॉलिसी क्वेश्चन में ही लिखी हुई है. तो यू हैव टू डू इट. जब वो बेस्ट वाला होता है, वी सीन इन द मार्किंग स्कीम्स कि sometimes they don't mention that you have to do a counter of the alternative policies that you suggested. Although I always recommend कि please हमेशा alternative के बारे में भी लिखा करो. तो ट्रांसफर पेमेंट्स की जो डिसएडवांटेज वाली साइड है, ट्रांसफर पेमेंट्स का तो सबसे बड़ा प्रॉब्लम है, इट्स द कॉस्टली एस्पेक्ट ऑफ इट. Government may not have the funds and there is an opportunity cost involved in this whole thing. तो ये एक प्रॉब्लम हो सकता है. दूसरा, वी ऑल्सो नो कि ये जो डायरेक्ट फूड वाउचर्स और ये होते हैं, इसके अंदर जो है these goods can actually be sold illegally. And we've seen this happen in Pakistan also. We're not in Pakistan, we don't have the food vouchers, but we know कि जब गवर्नमेंट लोगों को सब्सिडाइज करती है और फूड डायरेक्ट प्रोविजनिंग करती है, डायरेक्ट डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन फ्लड एरियाज में एंड ऑल, we've seen that those products come back into the market and they end up getting sold in the market. So वो unintended use के ऊपर जो है वो आ जाती है. So make sure that you do talk about the alternative side. Okay. अब Now that we have explained कि किस तरीके से maximum will work and the problems minimum will work and their problems, right? Now, what we want to do is based on the question, which is likely to be more effective. Now I have to compare one with the other. ठीक है? पहले मैंने ये कंपैरिजन नहीं किया था, पहले मैंने सिर्फ ये किया था मिनिमम हाउ इट वर्क्स एंड हाउ इट डज नॉट, transfer payments, how it works and how it does not. Now, in evaluation, I want to argue how this policy works better than this policy, or if this policy works better than this policy, right? That's my evaluation, which is likely to be more effective. तो उसके अंदर I think, in my opinion, my personal opinion, I already have a thought process on this. मेरी नजर के अंदर जो है ट्रांसफर पेमेंट्स much better, and I'll tell you why. In my opinion, any policy which takes you away from the price mechanism, demand and supply forces, जिस तरीके से minimum or maximum prices हैं, when something takes you away from the market mechanism, I feel it brings a greater problem in the economy. ये shortages और surpluses जो होते हैं, ये मार्केट में अनसर्टेनिटीज क्रिएट कर देते हैं, और उसकी वजह से जो रिएक्शन आता है मार्केट्स के अंदर, ब्लैक मार्केट्स का या इनफॉर्मल का, वो काफी ज्यादा डैमेजिंग होता है। ठीक है? प्लस दीज सॉर्ट ऑफ पॉलिसीज आर टू vague in how big of an impact it might actually create in the market. तो फूड एसेंशियल्स में जब आपने पी मिनिमम बिलो इक्विलिब्रियम लगाया, तो आपने ये देखा कि प्रोड्यूसर डिस्करेज हो गए एंड दे आर डिसाइडिंग टू allocate less resources in this. You have discouraged producers. There's a disincentive that you've ended up creating. And you have created a hunger in the market, a more higher demand in the market. It's a recipe for disaster, basically. Because ये जो आपने disincentive create किया है, this will have a much more long-term impact on the food side, because you sort of sent a signal to the producer of basic essentials that we have the ability to lower the price, and since you are discouraged, now go do something better. And that is how they're taking this information. And that is going to really create a bigger problem in the future, maybe food crisis in the future. और ब्लैक मार्केट्स के लिए आप ऑलमोस्ट एक रेसिपी क्रिएट कर दी है आपने, एंड नाउ यू हैव टू एंड अप स्पेंडिंग मनी and in how to sort of like stop this informal, because informal will create for essential foods. However, essential foods के अंदर inelastic डिमांड होती है और inelastic सप्लाई होती है। तो ये जो शॉर्टेज का प्रॉब्लम है, ये इतना बड़ा है नहीं वैसे तो। Theory is saying that. I'm not saying that, but the theory is saying जब demand and supply curves are inelastic, then the shortage is not so much. So majority of the people are actually able to afford it. Very few people are not able to afford, so you can import goods for them, and black market problem might not be such a big problem, right? So I've made a sort of like a counter argument also on the minimum might not be that as bad comparatively. But जहां तक ट्रांसफर पेमेंट्स की बात है, वी कंसिडर्ड कि इकोनॉमी के अंदर ट्रांसफर पेमेंट का सक्सेस वुड बी हाउ वेल योर इकोनॉमी इज एबल टू आइडेंटिफाई पुअर पीपल and how effectively are they able to distribute that good in the market to those people, right? If you don't have a good system of identifying people, then you will end up creating a lot of inefficiency over there, and it might become a very costly, and a lot of goods will come in the market illegally sold in the market. So do you have that mechanism to distribute the good effectively to the majority of the people? Developing countries don't tend to have a very good system, so they may actually fail in that. What I have noticed is that kids do have a very tendency of coming up with a third policy and suggesting that this third policy might actually be better. I would recommend you to avoid doing that. अगर मार्किंग स्कीम में कभी ऐसी सिचुएशन आ भी गई where a third policy uh, might be marked, तो वो ऑप्शनल होगा. ठीक है. Your main question is about transfer payments and it is about maximum price. So your discussion and decision should be in terms of low income consumers. Your answer should continuously focus on low income consumers with the basic food stuff. And then whatever your conclusion is, based on whatever scenario you've created, uh, doesn't matter. There is no right answer to it. As long as your evaluation discussion and your narrowing down or circumstances that you've created supports that point of view. We just want to see कि after doing all the explanation upar, have you been able in your evaluation, have you been able to come up with a more insightful information on the policies and made the conclusion that which one is most likely to be effective. Please do choose a side. Okay? बहुत ही कोई रेयर केस होगा जहां अगर तुमको लगता है कि I can't really do it, then don't do it. Otherwise, circumstances के अंदर, if you create certain circumstances, then obviously certain policies will definitely be better. Um, इसके अंदर what I can see is definitely if the government does not have a good mechanism and if the government does not have relevant funds available कि वो effectively transfer payments नहीं distribute कर सकते, तो maybe a minimum pricing policy is a better one to do because of कि उसमें inelastic demand होता है तो कोई बहुत major shortage create नहीं हो जाएगा और major discouragement नहीं हो जाएगी, right? So that is how I would prefer to. Any
It
questions?